The reality is, nobody thinks this was a big victory.
So Piers Morgan just delivered one of the most brutal takedowns of Trump's Iran war we've seen, and it's backed by leaked White House documents from the New York Times. We're talking about Netanyahu manipulating Trump, economic catastrophe, and a war sold on completely false premises. This is explosive.
The furore about President Trump's vow to end Iranian civilization was not about a fear he was about to do that or a hope that he would. It was about the foundational idea that the United States is a bulwark against exactly the kind of atrocities he foreshadowed. If the US is capable and willing to eradicate an entire population, how does it have the moral authority to be a global arbiter of right and wrong? But Donald Trump doesn't seem interested in that. Clearly, he sees the US as a muscular superpower which can throw its weight around to get what it wants. And to be clear, many people support him about that.
The moral authority critique hits harder now, given the mounting concerns about Trump's mental fitness. When you threaten to annihilate 90 million people, you're not projecting strength, you're revealing instability. That's exactly why his own cabinet is reportedly discussing the 25th Amendment behind closed doors.
So amid the shrieking noise and spin about the 11th hour ceasefire agreement, it's worth asking a simple question. Did the US get what it wants? Well, the Strait of Hormuz is open, just as it was before the war began. But nobody is in any doubt about the fact that Iran controls it. In fact, some versions of the text refer to guaranteeing Iran's dominance. The Iranian regime is wounded and weakened, but there's no doubt that it's the same regime. Several branches have been hacked off, but the trunk and the roots remain.
The Strait of Hormuz handles about 20% of global oil transit. That's $1.2 trillion in trade annually. Iran now controlling it with de facto international recognition is a massive geopolitical shift. What was supposed to be regime change became regime legitimization on the world's most critical shipping lane.
Many of Iran's military targets have been destroyed, but Iran still has its uranium, its ballistic missiles, and its proxies across the region. The Iranian plan, which Trump now calls a workable basis for talks, includes reparations for the damage caused, the lifting of all sanctions, and the release of Iranian funds seized by the United States. It's a multi-billion-dollar windfall. What does he think they'll do with it? And on the question of cost, the US has now spent more than $30 billion on the war so far. 15 US soldiers are dead. Thousands of Iranian civilians are dead. Trump's approval ratings are a record low. And his base is at war with itself, all as the US prepares for elections, which could handicap or even end his presidency.
Those numbers tell the story. $30 billion spent, 15 American soldiers dead, Trump's approval at 31%, the lowest in modern history. Meanwhile, Iran keeps its uranium stockpile and gets billions in unfrozen assets. This wasn't a victory, it was an expensive lesson in strategic incompetence.
But if this is what a historic victory looks like, well, Mr. President, I wouldn't be so sure to claim that. First tonight, I'm joined by Megyn Kelly, host of the Megyn Kelly Show. Megyn, what's been the point of it all?
Kelly's been consistently right about this war from day one. She called out the Israeli manipulation early when everyone else was buying the administration's spin. Having someone with her credibility and conservative credentials dismantling Trump's narrative makes this critique impossible to dismiss as partisan.
It was clearly a Netanyahu-driven operation. He had persuaded Trump to come with him. Then we had Antony Blinken saying, well, actually, he tried to do this when Biden was president, when Obama was president, and both times those two guys said, no, we're not going to come with you, and then he didn't attack. So he clearly got third time lucky with an American president that would come with him. But I remember early on, you and I and others who dared to suggest that we take Rubio at his word, that actually this was all at Israel's behest. Once again, we were anti-Semitic if we said that.
This validates what critics said from the beginning. Netanyahu shopped this war to Obama, then Biden, and both said no. The smear campaign against anyone questioning Israeli influence was designed to silence exactly this kind of revelation. Now we have documented proof they were right all along.
Fascinating. I mean, what's most fascinating to me, they've got somebody on the inside telling them exactly what happened in that situation room, which is fascinating. But when you see it all laid out, it's crystal clear. That's exactly what happened. That Netanyahu got in that situation room at the White House, like you say, unprecedented. The way he had the guy from Mossad on the big screen, he had him there with his... It was like two equal partners. And he persuaded Trump in that room to go in.
The leak itself is stunning. Someone inside that situation room was so disturbed by what they witnessed, they're talking to journalists. That suggests serious concern among insiders about how Trump got manipulated. When your own people are leaking against you, the political damage is catastrophic.
But the reality is, nobody thinks this was a big victory for the United States. Nobody can see anything but actually a bit of a humiliation, not militarily, because America can beat anyone when it comes to a military punch-up. But what Iran has now discovered is that as long as it can control the Strait of Hormuz, it can control the global economy, and therefore it can, if it has enough patience, play out the long game with the President of the United States, who will have to cave.
Iran played the long game brilliantly. They absorbed the initial strikes, then strangled global energy markets through the strait. Trump had to choose between economic collapse and backing down. He chose backing down. That's not American strength. That's getting outmaneuvered by a regional power.
Trump hasn't brought this to an end out of some great desire for peace. He's brought it to an end because he could see that the economic and political damage was getting worse by the day.
Trump's ceasefire timing tells you everything. Right as gas prices hit $6 nationally and his approval crashed. This wasn't statesmanship, it was damage control. He realized the war was destroying his presidency and potentially handing Democrats a supermajority in the midterms.
This looked like madness. There's a very interesting piece, I think, where Stephen Chung pops up in the New York Times piece, who emerges as one of the smarter characters, actually, that Trump has around him, who said, well, how does all this sit with we're not going to go and wage war in the Middle East, which is what we campaigned on? How does this sit with America first? This will have an obvious effect on prices, on inflation, on gas pump costs and so on. How does any of this work? And there's no real answer, according to the New York Times, in the room to that. He just raises this spectre of, this is the elephant in the room. This is exactly the opposite to what we campaigned on. So I think politically it's been disastrous for Donald Trump. And I just don't understand, other than he got bamboozled by Netanyahu, why he took such a gigantic risk.
Stephen Chung raising the obvious contradiction. How do you reconcile America first with a Middle East war that's crushing American families economically? Trump had no answer because there isn't one. He got bamboozled into betraying his core campaign promise by Netanyahu's sales pitch.
The Israeli premier, it says, planned a simple mission with swift regime change, but it had to be now. Or General Kane, the top US military official, reportedly told the president, "Sir, this is, in my experience, standard operating procedure for the Israelis. They oversell, and their plans are not always well developed. They know they need us, and that's why they're hard selling." All of this appears to echo the position of Vice President J.D. Vance and the former Secretary of State Antony Blinken. For several weeks now, we've been told it's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory to say that Israel dragged the US into this war. Perhaps the only people who can plausibly declare victory today are those who said the evidence suggested otherwise.
General Kane's warning proved prophetic. Israelis oversell and their plans aren't well developed. Even Trump's top military advisor saw this coming. The people labeled as anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists for questioning Israeli influence have been completely vindicated by Trump's own officials.
What is clear from that is that the Israelis, maybe this was an honest mistake on their part, a misreading of the situation, but they certainly appear to be of the belief, if you took out the Ayatollah and some of the top people with him, that this would then lead to an uprising by the people, and that amid all this chaos, there would be no ability to close the Strait of Hormuz. Well, none of that has really happened. Yes, they got rid of the Ayatollah, but he's just been replaced by other similarly minded people. And then there's been no uprising by the Iranian people whatsoever. And of course, the Strait of Hormuz has been held in a kind of stranglehold by the Iranians in a very powerful way. It has to be conceded, which has caused enormous damage to the global economy. They've basically controlled that strait now for 4 or 5 weeks, and it's caused hell. And none of that appears to have been predicted by the Israelis in their sales pitch to Trump to join them on this war.
Every single assumption in Israel's war plan collapsed. No popular uprising, no regime change, no securing the strait. Just Iran stronger than before with economic leverage over the entire world. The Israelis either catastrophically misjudged the situation or deliberately misled Trump about the likely outcomes.
The 12-day war is fascinating because I distinctly remember, and I'm sure Will remember it differently to me, but I remember Donald Trump at the end of the 12-day war saying that this had put back any aspirations by the Iranians to build a nuclear weapon decades. that we had obliterated their nuclear capabilities. It was done, gone. And here we are 9 months later having to launch a full-fledged war in Iran because the threat remains apparently not just the same, but so imminent that America had to act immediately.
The logical contradiction is devastating. If the 12-day strikes really set Iran's nuclear program back decades, as Trump claimed, why did we need a full war 9 months later? Either Trump was lying then about the success, or he's lying now about the threat. Both scenarios indict his credibility.
Secondly, the enriched uranium remains in Iran. None of that has been secured by either the Americans or Israelis as we speak. Thirdly, the Straits of Hormuz remain under the control of the Iranians, which they weren't. It wasn't in control of it before this war started. And it is, despite what you say, they are now charging money. Apparently, they want to charge $1 a barrel, was the last thing I read. And Trump's all for it because it's going to make everyone rich. So they've got the control of that. They've continued to fire rockets, it seems, at some of their Gulf state neighbors. So I'm looking at this historic victory and I'm thinking, well, where's the victory? What is the victory? Because I don't see it. And forgive me if I take with a pinch of salt this idea
right,
that
well,
now...
let's try this by historical analogy.
Let me finish my point, you can respond. That apparently we're now supposed to believe that rather like 8-9 months ago, Iran's capability of building a nuclear weapon has been destroyed like it was 9 months ago. Well, why can't they just pop up again in 9 months? They've still got all the enriched uranium. What's going to stop them? So, look, I put it to you that the charge sheet against the claim of historic victory is pretty big.
That's the comprehensive case against calling this victory. Iran keeps its uranium, controls the strait, charges transit fees, and gets billions in sanctions relief. Meanwhile, America spent $30 billion, lost 15 soldiers, and damaged its global standing. Where exactly is the winning?
And I think the idea that from the White House, you issue a statement in your own words threatening the annihilation of an entire civilization, an entire country of 90 million Iranians, I thought was disgraceful, absolutely disgraceful, and could well be a crime.
The genocide threat against 90 million Iranians isn't just morally reprehensible, it potentially violates international law. With Trump's cognitive decline increasingly obvious and his violent rhetoric escalating, those 25th Amendment discussions in his cabinet make perfect sense. This is dangerous instability.
To be clear, Will, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, by most experts' analysis, has been the single greatest shock in a negative way to the global economy ever. Ever.
Well, that can't be true because oil prices were higher in the at the beginning of the Ukraine-Russia war.
No,
so that just can't be true.
This has had a greater negative impact on the global economy specific to energy of anything we've seen ever. And it's going to get worse.
Gas prices averaging $5.80 nationally, heating costs up 40%, inflation back above 6%, this strait closure is devastating American families. The economic shock is hitting working-class Trump voters hardest, which explains why his base is fracturing. They're paying the price for Netanyahu's war.
The military carried out everything that was asked of it. The public demonstrated amazing resilience. But Netanyahu failed politically, failed strategically, and didn't meet a single one of the goals he himself set. It will take us years to repair the political and strategic damage that Netanyahu wrought due to arrogance, negligence, and a lack of strategic planning.
When Israel's own opposition leader calls it the worst political disaster in their history, that tells you everything. Netanyahu dragged both countries into a strategic catastrophe that strengthened Iran, weakened America, and achieved none of its stated objectives. Even Israeli officials admit complete failure.